Welcome to Miranda's Insights number 10. And this is the last video of my trip here in Thailand for February 2018. And today I'd like to talk about the topic of running from the invisible boredom. The invisible boredom. So I've been really contemplating this topic my whole trip. It started with the emptiness in the beginning of the trip. And I've noticed that in deep down inside, and perhaps you may acknowledge this as well, that my busyness, my desire to be engaged in things and to, in a sense, be distracted from this sense of boredom. This boredom can be quite painful. On the scale of pain, it's probably not that painful. But if you're like me, I'm really, really sensitive, and I've done a lot of work on myself. And I'm always trying to live the highest state of consciousness that a human being can possibly live. And I'm doing all kinds of explorations and investigations into the nature of who I am and the nature of things. And so this one thing called boredom is something that I don't know very well because I have been running away from it. So all the things that I do is because I'm afraid of this thing called boredom. So I'd like to explore it a little more. In my investigations here, I've noticed that there are two types of boredom. And the first boredom is the conventional sense, the one that you could probably recognize. Most of us don't feel it because we're too busy being distracted. So the way the boredom would look like would be, say I'm engaged with a pleasurable object, let's say the topic of chocolate or coffee or a good friend or a partner or whatever. And there comes a time when I first engage, there's pleasure with the object or the person, situation. But then with time, so there's a time factor here, and with certain circumstances, then what happens is the object no longer seems to produce pleasure. And I find this really interesting. So I am no longer experiencing pleasure, and all I want is pleasure. Let's just say I'm interacting with the object for that purpose. Then what happens is there's this disinterest in that particular object. And then the disinterest turns into a rejection of the object. So now, once I have lost interest in that particular object, there's this sense of emptiness or boredom that arises inside. Now, if I really, really slow things down, now this whole chain of actions or reactions happens so quickly that the average person doesn't even notice. But my practice, of course, is to slow things down and notice and go into great detail so that when I understand how things function, I can find my freedom through all of this. So I'm just going to lay it out for you how I've been noticing it. So when the object no longer gives me any more pleasure, then I get bored of it. After that, then there's this sense, this thing that arises, this energy of agitation, kind of like this uncomfortableness that arises. And it's something to do with the lack of pleasure because I've been seeking it. So when this thing arises, then it turns into desire, or the I've got to have a new contact with a new object in order to re-experience the pleasure that I'm looking for. Now, this pleasure doesn't always have to be like a sensual pleasure. It could be, for me, usually it shows up like a sense of purpose in life. So I get busy with my projects, my things that I want to do to engage with others, to feel a sense of fulfillment. But it can come in the form of pleasure, it can come in the form of a distraction, it can come in the form of trying to find a sense of purpose in life. But it's all coming from this recognition or this realization or this fear that the things and people and situations that I've been interacting with are empty. And then this excruciating sense of boredom, which most of us don't recognize as painful. But when you're sensitive, like myself, then it's actually really, really painful to have to face this. So that's the conventional sense of boredom. And so what we do is we go and chase another object to receive that sense of pleasure or sense of fulfillment of some sort. So there's another kind of boredom that I'd like to talk about that I think will help us towards more freedom. And they call that wise boredom. It's the boredom of wisdom. So, and there are like 3 or 4 aspects to this. So first of all, if I'm engaging with an object of pleasure, let's just use the chocolate example. In reality, that piece of chocolate has no pleasure in it, right? Like, let's be truthful here. The chocolate itself has no pleasure in it. So it's empty of pleasure. It is only what it is, okay? So that's one aspect. This is a wise thing to understand. Chocolate doesn't have pleasure in it. The other thing is that I, as an individual, separate from everything else, am under the process of constant change. So I may not even be able to experience pleasure with contact with that piece of chocolate every time I contact it. Maybe I feel differently. Maybe I had too much chocolate and I feel sick to my stomach, and then I have one more piece of chocolate and now the chocolate is not pleasurable anymore. That's an example. Things change, the chocolate changes, I change. So that's the second piece of wisdom. The other piece of wisdom is that when I really look at the object, there's actually 2 objects. There is the object that's out there, that's the physical object called chocolate or coffee or food or a person. And that's the reality out there that we've all agreed upon, that this is the object. And that is only what it is. There's no pain or pleasure in it. It's just what the object is. Then there's that object will have a reflection in my consciousness. And that is the one that I attribute, the one that has pleasure. So every time I think about chocolate, I get pleasure. So I associate the picture of chocolate in my head with pleasure. And it has to be a particular picture, and the pleasure matches that. It doesn't, and the reality is, because they're 2 separate objects, one in my head and one out there in physical reality, they never always match when they're in contact. So when my image meets the chocolate and I'm there eating the chocolate, they don't always produce the pleasure that I'm looking for. So this is wisdom. This is understanding the nature of things rather than going into straight reaction and craving and desiring and just kind of going into that whole cycle of pain and pleasure. So the last thing that I want to say, which is the point of this whole lecture here, is that I don't have to be restricted or limited to this human being who is bound and caught up by the cycle of pain and pleasure. That's not all that I am. I'm not limited to that. I am actually vaster than all of that. I am the whole. I am everything. I am life. So I am not limited to just amness. I'm everything. So I am at the source of pain and pleasure. this is if there's any identity that we need to have, even though we're trying to clear our identities on a human individual level, but if there's any identity that I'm going to identify with, it's going to be the identity of the whole. And so I am the watcher, the observer, the knower, the experiencer of the pleasure and of the pain. And I'm also the experiencer of the boredom. So whenever I get disinterested or bored of a person, a place, a thing, which can happen when you're traveling, you can be so stimulated with everything that you're experiencing that after a while you start to feel and sense the emptiness of everything. And then there's a disillusionment in the object. And what are you going to do next after you get disillusioned in your object? Well, you got to rise up. The vibration needs to rise up. We meditate on the source, what's behind the background of all the things that come into physical appearance and in physical sense reality. We realize that there's this extra vision, this extra knowing, that none of it is solid and real and has anything of substance in it. This is wise boredom, knowing that nothing really actually does have anything in it. But I do. My source does. I'm at the source of everything that I'm experiencing. So that is my true identity. I am the source of my boredom. So I'm going to put my attention there. All right. So I'm not running from boredom anymore. I am actually embracing the source of boredom, and that will be my true identity. All right. So it's kind of noisy here on the river. There's a lot of activity on the river, but that's it for today, and I'll see you in another video. Bye for now.